All right, we're recording. So anyway, like I said, it is early, but I'm recording because I'm starting the announcements early because it is being recorded. So people can just watch this and get the announcements. So I have to teach from home on Friday and Monday, which means we'll have to be online Friday and Monday. So since we have to be online for Friday and Monday, it wouldn't be fair for me to require you to do the questions. Well, no, whatever. So for Friday and Monday, we're going to have the online option as we always do. I guess it won't be an option for Friday and Monday because I won't be able to come in. So for those days, as long as you're watching live, then the letters will, or the attendance words will suffice. I just don't think it would be fair for me to be like, not give you the option of coming in or watching it online and then forcing you to do the questions. So, yeah. And again, this is being recorded and it's early, but I'll also type that in my announcement when I post this video today. And as far as attendance goes, you guys who are here in person, if you don't mind just sending me an email to remind me you were here on time, you'll get extra credit for being here in person. And the people who are online live will get extra credit for being here live. And then people who watch the videos and answer the questions will just get regular old credit. All right. That being said, let me pull up the PowerPoint while I remind everybody that lab is not on. We're not meeting for lab this week. You know, we're getting towards the end here, so I want you guys to be able to focus on your studying for the finals and things like that. But despite that, I am here if you need me. Morning. All right, well, got a little bit less than 2 minutes. For the final, I thought I posted the exact date, but maybe I didn't. So I'll go back and look at that for your own knowledge. And this is helpful not just for this class, but if you go to the WVSU website, or even if you just use Google and hit WVSU final exam schedule, it should bring you to that page. Of course, again, I'm going to give you the time. I can almost guarantee it's going to be that Monday at 8 a.m. It's when it almost always is. It'll be online as usual, unless you want to take it in person. So if you want to take it in person, now's the time to start thinking about and let me know if you want to take the final in person. Again, if you're taking it in person, there will be no time limits. Well, I don't say no time limits. I can't sit with you in the office until 9 p.m. But there will be no 1 hour, 100-minute time limit. Because I think that's what it is for the final. So you'll have 100 minutes to do about 100 questions. And the questions will be 50 questions from the new stuff, so chapters 13, 19, and 20, and 50 questions from exams 1, 2, and 3. So half old stuff, half new stuff. And when I say old stuff, I mean verbatim. I'm going to copy and paste those questions. So, like when you're studying for new stuff, you've got to look at the study guide and try to figure out how I'm going to reword the questions. And that's still the case for the new stuff. But for the old stuff, you just literally study your old exams because I'm going to copy and paste those questions. Question? Okay. And I plan on them being random, I think. I plan on hitting a shuffle button, basically, and letting fate choose which of the 50 questions come from the old stuff. Because I hate to, say, all right, focus on all the important stuff, and then I accidentally throw in something that's not important. I don't know. Anyway, let's get started again. It's 8:01, so that's a good time to start. If you're here in person, make sure to send me an email, please, to remind me that you were here in person. You'll get a little extra credit for being here in person. And if you're online, and I don't think there is anybody online right now, but if you are, again, I'm going to do keywords. You can send me the keywords for extra credit, but you'll still need to do the questions for attendance. And for those, well, let's leave it at that. At the very end, after I'm done recording, I have another announcement for those of you who just came in a little bit later about what we're doing for class on Friday and Monday. Anyway, let's jump back into it. We were talking about natural selection. We're finally diving into it, about how Darwin came up with his ideas, or we already talked about how he came up with his ideas. Now we're really talking about natural selection. We left off talking about this guy named Thomas Malthus, who I'm not going to ask you questions about, but you could look into him. And again, his ideas were basically overpopulation is a problem for humans. So Darwin was like, well, yeah, if that's a case, then it's got to be the case for the natural environment too. And it's true. Like with those, again, I'm going to use these moths as an example because you did the lab already. With those colored moths, if there was only a few of them, if there was a very small population to begin with, maybe being camouflaged or not camouflaged wouldn't even matter, right? Because maybe those predators that are eating the moths, I'm sure they eat other things too, right? So if there was already a small moth population, maybe it wouldn't even matter because maybe those birds would be eating other things. But the fact that there were a bunch of moths and they were fighting for resources, in particular, the important resource in that situation was a place to hide, right? That is actually a resource, hiding places. So that gave them an advantage, and therefore they were allowed to survive, and therefore they passed along the gene that gave them that advantage. If I had more time, I could give you a million other examples, not a million. I could give you many other examples of natural selection where, it's a struggle to survive, and anything that gives any individual an advantage over the rest will make it more likely for them to survive and reproduce and pass along those genes that gave them the advantage. But we're running short on time, so I'll leave it at that. You could look it up for independent work if you want, because remember, you can still do independent work for extra credit. Okay, so the essence of natural selection is unequal reproduction. I think there's a question like that on your study guide, which means, and that is one of the ones that might make the cut to be on the exam. The essence of natural selection is unequal reproduction. Of course, I think it's worded a little bit different. In other words, again, when things in the wild they basically just pop out as many offspring as they can in the wild, right? Humans have gotten to the point where we think about it, like, should we have kids yet? Should we not have kids? How many kids could we have? Unlike, you got people like the Duggar who have probably maxed out the number of children, offspring that a human could put out. But for the rest of us, I think most of us don't do that, right? But that's not how it is in nature, right? In nature, because it's a struggle to survive, you just want to have as many offspring as possible, generally speaking, and then hope that some of them survive. And of course, we'll talk about this later, but there's also trade-offs between having fewer, more well-for offspring and more, less well-cared-for offspring. And we'll talk about that in a different chapter. But still, even for things like elephants that have relatively few offspring, they're still doing it as often as they can, right? It's not like there's an elephant like, I'm not filling offspring this year, so I'm not going to do it, right? Even then, they're still putting out as much as possible. Anyway, for the bullet point here, this second one. In natural selection, individuals whose traits better enable them to obtain food or escape predators or tolerate physical conditions will survive and reproduce more successfully, passing these adaptive traits to the offspring. So again, in the case of the peppered moths for the lab, their advantage was the ability to escape predators. And that's just an example. And I guess for the first term for the attendance words will be escape predators. Why not? Since it's right there already underlined. So then Darwin, let me back up really quick. What you might not remember from Monday is when we were kind of ending that conversation. What we were talking about was artificial selection and how Darwin was like looking at breeds of dogs and breeds of horses and how humans have changed things and thought, well, if humans can do this in a short amount of time, then surely nature could do the same thing. So that brings us to where we are here. Darwin reasoned that if artificial selection brings significant change in a relatively short period of time, natural selection could modify species considerably over hundreds or thousands of generations or millions, right? So again, for the exam, the important stuff on this slide is the fact that the essence of natural selection is the unequal reproduction. And basically, like the second bullet point says, anything that helps an individual survive is going to help them, therefore, pass along whatever genes it is responsible for helping them survive. Any questions about this slide? A lot of words on it, but overall, it's pretty simple. All right. Natural selection and actions. We've already talked about the evidence of evolution. We've talked about the basic idea of natural selection. Let's talk about natural selection in action. Nothing on this slide is going to be on the exams. It's kind of an introduction. So not only do we have evidence of evolution, like, hey, look, evolution has happened. We also can see it in action. We're seeing it happen currently. Of course, this book was written before COVID-19 happened. But COVID-19 is a great example of natural selection in action. And it's not on the slide, obviously, because I teach out of your book. But, think about all these different strands. You have the Delta strand and the Omicron, right? All those, that's natural selection. Because what happens is, because it's a virus, it hijacks your machinery, right? It's an mRNA virus. So what it's doing is the genetic information goes into your cell, your ribosomes read it and build all the proteins as instructed, the proteins to make a new virus. And there's mistakes that happen sometimes, like we talked about in the last chapter. And because of that, sometimes those mistakes make it to where maybe somebody catches the virus and that's the end of it. Like there was a mistake, and the mistake it made was so bad that the virus just died and didn't do anything. But in some cases, that mistake may have made it a little bit more likely to survive. Or like the Omicron virus, whatever the mistakes were, it was more likely to get passed along somehow, but somehow less likely to kill you, right? So that's what happens. Mistakes happen. Anyway, going back to the slide here, the book example of natural selection in action that's very common is pesticide resistance. This is a pretty common idea here. Or not common, pretty simple idea. It is also common, but basically here's how it happens. If you're a farmer, you've got a field, you've got some pests, you spray down the pesticide to kill it, whatever kind of pest it is. You use the specific pesticide for it. You spray it down and you kill nearly all of them, right? You kill most of the population. But surely some of them out there, because they're not all genetically identical, they're not all clones, surely some of them have something different in them that makes them resistant to that pesticide. And if that's the case, even though you killed almost the entire population, you still have those few left. And those few left are the ones that are resistant to your pesticide. So eventually they repopulate. And now you have this whole new population, but now the whole new big population is resistant to insect pesticides or resistant to pesticides. Because again, you killed the ones that were not resistant, and all you have left are basically the superbugs, if you want to call them that. It's a very not proper term because it's not necessarily bugs. Bugs is a specific type of insect, but we won't get into that. And really quickly, just so you know, how many of you guys have had, you don't have to answer this because this is HIPAA, but I'll answer it. How many of you have ever been prescribed an antibiotic? I have. And you might notice they say, make sure you take it for the full 10 days. And they emphasize that even when you start feeling better, make sure you keep taking it. I just had this conversation with my son about a month ago because he's like, I feel better. Why do I have to take it? Because he hates taking medication. And it's the same reason, sort of. So what happens in that situation is you take the, you're feeling horrible. You've got some infection. You take the antibiotic. You kill almost all the bacteria that's infecting you, so you feel better. So sometimes people quit taking it. But what really happened is they didn't kill all the bacteria. They just killed most of it. And that's why you feel better, because most of the infection is gone. But what's left is those tough ones, the ones that could survive the first or maybe second or maybe even third or fourth dose of the antibiotic, right? They could survive a few doses because there was something about them that made them, if not completely resistant, at least partially. So what happens then is you've killed all the weak ones, and now all the strong ones are there to survive. And those are the things that reproduce. And now you have a stronger bacteria in you, like a worse infection. So that's just something to keep in mind too. Again, natural selection in action. Any questions about this? Either what I said about the antibiotics or the pesticide resistance? All right. And here's just a picture, a very simple picture of what we're trying to say with the pesticide resistance. So imagine, again, we're going back to this idea of alleles. You have this version or that version sometimes. Sometimes there's more than two. But anyway, in this case, whatever gene it was, this one with the red allele, maybe that makes it immune to the pesticide. So we have two of them out of this whole big population that are immune to the pesticides. So the pesticides are sprayed. They all die except the ones that were immune. Those are the ones that survived to repopulate. And now the whole population, the resulting population is now immune to the pesticides. Any question? And I know this should go without saying, but you never know with some people. So if you're studying this, it's not, don't memorize the details, because there's not going to be a question where I say, in pesticide resistance, is it the green allele or the red allele that makes you immune? This is just a visualization, right? So it's not like there is no green allele or red allele. It's just a visualization. Any questions? I'll probably ask you what kind of airplane is used. No, I'm just kidding. I won't ask you that either. All right. Let's talk about some key points about natural selection. I guess I'll give you the second word for attendance, which will be extra credit today. Candy. For some reason, there's candy up here. Candy, if you can see it online. All right. This is a very important point. Very, very, very important point. I kind of hinted at it on Monday. Natural selection is more of an editing process than creative mechanism. Meaning there is no like end goal, because if there was, humans wouldn't have all these flaws that we have that I don't have time to get into. Maybe I'll share them with you. But the one I already did tell you about was the whole thing about vitamin C. Right? Why would we have a broken gene in us that doesn't do anything? If it was an editing process, well, first of all, it would have never been broken to begin with. Humans would still be creating vitamin C just like almost every other mammal on Earth, but we don't. Therefore, we have to eat it or we die. That's the first thing. Second of all, if it was a purposeful editing thing, then we would just get rid of it. Like, all right, the gene doesn't work anymore. We don't need it. Let's just get rid of it. But that's not how it works. Or it is an editing process. It's not a creative process. Another good way of putting this is, and I want to reemphasize this because I know some people definitely didn't get it, the concept at first with the natural selection lab. There was no moth in that situation that said, uh-oh, it's getting dark out here. I need to be dark. Right? No moth changed to be a dark. No single moth was born light and went dark. What happened was there was a light moth that happened to have some mutations randomly, had nothing to do with the smoke, the original mutation. It just happened to happen. And that light moth had offspring that just happened to be dark. So that wasn't creative, right? No, a single light moth changed to be a dark moth. And on top of that, that one light moth that gave birth, or excuse me, had offspring that were dark, did not do that on purpose. So that light moth wasn't like, it's getting dark. I better have some dark offspring, and created dark offspring. It didn't happen that way. So yeah, to that point, natural selection can only amplify or diminish heritable traits. So again, using that example, natural selection amplified the dark trait because it just so happened that when that mutation happened, there also happened to be a lot of pollution around. Therefore, being dark was good camouflage. So that's the one that amplified. So obviously, the one that it diminished was the light color. It just so happens that at that point, at that location on Earth, that it was advantageous to be dark. So therefore, the light color was being diminished. Again, all that being said, an organism may, in its lifetime, acquire characteristics that help it survive, but acquired characteristics cannot be passed on to the offspring. For example, I don't know much about this coal smoke, but let's just assume this is what happens, or what could happen. Let's assume there is a light moth that was born light. There it is. It was born light, and it just does get covered in soot. And its whole life, it is covered in soot, right? So let's say it was dark for its whole life, but it wasn't genetic, right? So maybe it did survive, and it did have a survival advantage. And it did pass along its genes. But the problem here is the genes it's passing along has nothing to do with its survival, because in that case, it acquired some characteristics, but it wasn't heritable characteristics. Does that make sense? It just happened to get covered in soot. Therefore, there is no genetic advantage to it. You guys clear with that? All right. And again, I use this example for grading the labs. I mentioned, because people said something along those lines for the one of the last questions on the lab, asking about how natural selection works. And if you just say they were camouflaged, then that's not a good enough answer, because humans are a good example of that, right? Humans in war, like, oh, well, those Marines had better camouflage than those Afghans or whatever. So therefore, the people with better camouflage are more likely to survive and make it home and reproduce. That's true, because the great camouflage that they got from the Marine Corps was an acquired characteristic, but that has nothing to do with their genes. Therefore, they can't pass along that characteristic. Any questions about this slide? All right, and I'll remind you, I'm going fast because we're a little bit behind. So If you don't feel like speaking up and tell me to slow down here, you can send me an email and I'll slow things down and we can meet later. Anyway, I've already kind of said this too. Natural selection is not goal directed. It doesn't lead to perfectly adapted organisms. I've definitely said that again with the human idea, right? But if it was perfectly adapted, we would not have a broken gene for vitamin C. There's other things too. If we were perfectly adapted, we would have better vision than other organisms, but they have better vision. I could go on and on. Again, I've got this book. Maybe I'll go through the book and pick out the highlights and share that with you. But there's a lot of things in the human body alone that just makes no sense. Think about dolphins, for example. What a great setup that is. How many do you guys know that people die when they eat sometimes, right? Because they choke to death? Well, guess what? That doesn't happen with dolphins because they've got a great setup where you eat in one hole and breathe in the other. It makes sense. Eating and drinking and breathing out of the same tube, really stupid idea. Not that we have a choice. Anyway, I should point this out. A trait that is favorable in one situation may be useless or even detrimental in a different circumstance. I'm going to give you other examples. This is a non-book example. Just really quickly, just imagine, hopefully you can tell that's an eagle talon, right? And that would be useful because what they do sometimes is they grab fish, right? So it would be useful to have big old sharp talons. Better chance of grabbing fish. Of course, they also fly, right? So it has to be like this perfect sweet spot. If they're too big, they're going to be too big to fly with, right? So you don't want to get them too big because that'll hinder your flying abilities, and that's not good if you're an eagle. Of course, if they're too small, and then you can fly better. But if they're too small, you're not going to be able to catch fish, and that'll hinder your ability to survive as an eagle. So that's one example. I'll give some more examples of things that are favorable in one situation and detrimental in the next. But again, for the exam, maybe this first bullet point is the important thing there. Natural selection is not goal directed. Those moths didn't say, we better become dark. It was all random. Any questions? All right. Whew, that's such a long chapter. Let's now talk about the evolution of populations. First, we're going to revisit this idea that we've kind of left off with the last exam, which is the source of genetic variations. Then we'll actually start getting into some specifics, some of which you should already be familiar with if you've looked at this week's lab. And if you haven't, that's okay because it's not due until Friday. But here we go. Let's jump into it. I guess the next word for attendance, I'll just circle it. There it is. I do that sometimes. I'll circle it instead of say it, but there it is. Anyway, Darwin did not know how the variations that are raw material for natural selection arise in the population. So again, he was figuring things out. He was looking at artificial selection. He's like, well, if humans can choose a trait, probably so could nature. But that being said, he didn't know where that came from, right? Why is one dog slightly bigger than the other? He didn't know where that came from. He also didn't know how those variations were passed down from parent to offspring, or from generation to generation to generation to generation. And another thing he didn't know was that at the same time, almost the same time, Mendel had already figured all this stuff out. They didn't have internet back then, right? So Mendel knew what Darwin didn't know. Darwin knew what Mendel didn't know. And if only they had been able to collaborate, who knows what we would know today. Anyway, this slide is just an introduction. There's no need to take notes. Nothing on this will be on the slide. Sources of genetic variation. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I've already emphasized this as I introduced it to you in the last unit. Individual variation occurs in all species. You should know that. You need to know it. There is variation in all species. Most populations have obvious physical differences. So that's what this picture here is a bunch of humans. Or look at us, look around the room. We have obvious physical differences. Look at our faces, different. Our sizes. All these things about us are different. And there's also a phenotypic variation observed at only the molecular level. And I'm going to talk about this here in a second too, but like sickle cell syndrome. We're going to talk about it later. But when you just look at a huge population of people, you can't point them out like, all right, sickle cell, definitely not sickle cell, maybe sickle cell, right? You can't tell by looking at somebody. So I guess the point here is that populations have variation, which is what you really need to know. And the sub-statement there is some of it's obvious, some of it you can look and see, some of it's more like molecular, right? Also, not all populations or variation in populations is heritable. So I mentioned again that we all have, if you look around the class, we all look different. One thing that you can't really tell is like if you look at, oh, he's got short hair, she's got long hair. So I bet he has short-haired offspring and she has long-haired offspring. Like, no, yes, that's a variation within this population, but that's not a heritable trait, right? Whether your hair is short or long, that's something I cut my hair more recently than she did, right? That's not heritable. That being said, again, you already know this, but it's only the genetic component of variation that's relevant to natural selection. If you can't pass it along, it doesn't matter. How many of you guys have a tattoo on your forearm? Just the two of us, right? But probably.
I got one.
Oh, so that's three of us. Now, most likely, when the three of us have offspring, or I already have them, I don't know if you guys do or not, but most likely they're not going to be born with a tattoo on the forearm, right? Because that's not heritable. So that has nothing to do with natural selection. Any questions about this slide? Here's just an example of garter snakes. This is the same species of snake, but you can see that there's variation in the population. That's a picture from your book. That's all I'm just showing. Again, same species, variation in the different ways that they look. All right. Again, the sources of genetic mutation. You already know this, but the original source, and this is an important concept, and it will be on the test. It's definitely on the study guide. What's the original source of this variation, basically, is the question. The short answer is mutation. All this slide could be just boiled down to that statement right there. Mutation is the original source of mutation. Mutation is the original source of variation. Again, not to beat a dead moth here, but that's how it worked with that moth, right? It wasn't the smoke that changed anything. It was a light-colored moth that had some sort of mutation, and when that thing had offspring, it had some dark-colored offspring because it was a random mutation. As you already know from the chapters that we just finished, an exam that almost all of you just took, a mutation is a change in the nucleotide sequence of the DNA. Of course, there's also other versions of mutations that we don't even get into in this chapter, but we did in the last chapter, right? Like it could be whole big chromosome chunks. But for now, what we're focused on in this chapter is the change in the sequence, the nucleotide sequence. And again, like I said, it is the ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as the raw material for evolution. That's the better part. That's the question on the exam, right? What is the ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as raw material for evolution? Mutations. In multicellular organisms, it is only the mutations in the cells that produce gametes that matter, which makes sense. So if I have a mutation in my arm and have more kids, which I better not be doing, I don't want to do that, but if I were to somehow have more kids, that mutation that I have in my arm doesn't matter. It's not going to be passed along to them because I don't make sperm, right? I don't make gametes from the cells in my arm. It only matters the cells that are making gametes, right? Otherwise, how would it matter? Because you don't pass along your cells. You only pass along you don't pass along all your cells. You only pass along those gametes that you create. So yeah, the important stuff on this slide, again, mutations, the raw material for evolution, for that variation. And the mutations are only relevant if they happen basically in the cells that are involved in reproduction. Any questions about this slide? All right. A change as small as a single nucleotide in a gene can have a significant effect on a phenotype. And now finally, we're going back to this example of sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease, I think officially the first time I brought this up was the chapter when we actually talked about mutations. And that's the one mutation I showed you. I was like, all right, if you change this one letter in this one codon, then you get this one different amino acid. And because you have this one different amino acid, the protein has a completely different shape. And because it has a completely different shape, then it can't carry oxygen the right way. And then therefore people, get the disease. And I like that your book points this out. A random change in an organism's DNA is not likely to improve its genome any more than randomly changing some word on a page is likely to improve a story, because it is random. The mutation is random, right? So yeah, and that's not anything you need to know for the exam, just something to keep in mind, right? Usually a mutation is either not going to be detrimental or just completely random and not do anything. More likely detrimental. Any questions about this slide? We're going to go back to this idea of sickle cell. That was just the introduction. A mutation that affects a protein's function will probably be harmful. So again, Sometimes it's random. Very rarely is it beneficial. Most likely it's going to be harmful. But on rare occasions, the mutated allele may improve the adaptation of the individual to its environment. It may enhance its reproductive success. Right? Those things go hand in hand. And this is more likely when the environment is changing in such a way that mutations were once disadvantageous or favorable under new conditions. Let's talk about all these really quickly. First, I'll talk about the sickle cell example. Then I'll explain that dude up there. So, does anybody know what this is on the bottom left? Perfect. Yes, a bad red blood cell. Specifically, it's a red blood cell that has sickle cell. That's what they look like, right? Usually, they look like this. Forget that one. But they look like these, like little red inner tubes, right? So when you have sickle cell, again, you've got the wrong shaped protein. It also makes your cell the wrong shape. And it is harmful because it's hard to carry oxygen that way. And that's the whole purpose of red blood cells, is to carry oxygen. But does anybody know, I don't really expect anybody to, but let me move this here. Come on. All right. Does anybody know what's up with those cells right here? They are dead. Any idea why? I mean, again, I don't expect anybody, but any guesses what's killed them? That's a great guess, especially considering what I was just saying. That makes sense in context. But no. So in this case, what you see in here, again, that's the sickle cell on the left. What you see on the right, other than those two dead ones, just normal old cells, right? So what you're seeing with those dead cells, those are cells that that's from somebody who has malaria. So malaria is when you get a parasite that lives inside your blood cell. In a sense, it's a lot like a virus because it needs you to reproduce. So it gets in your blood cells and reproduces and reproduces and reproduces. And then boom, finally it explodes. And then the parasites get into new red blood cells and it continues and continues. So that's what malaria is. But what happens is, for people that have sickle cell, it's harder for the parasite to infect their blood cells. So for people who have sickle cell, that is all of a sudden something that has improved their adaptation for their environment. Because now they are able to more likely to survive malaria. Now, of course, that is only helpful in places where malaria is more likely to be around, right? Does anybody know what kind of places have malaria? Not that you need to know. I'm just curious if anybody knows. Or does anybody know what carries malaria? India is a great place because that's actually where tonic comes from. And that's where that's one of the original medicines, the anti-malarials. But anyway, on that note, yeah, India is a great example. What carries it is mosquitoes. So any place that's really bad with mosquitoes, like the wet parts of India, Africa, right, places like that, that's where malaria is more prevalent. So therefore, like if you look at the general human population, does anybody know which group of people is more likely to have like higher percentages of sickle cell than anybody else? Exactly. Or people of African descent. Only reason I say not African Americans because you also got to look at African British and African and Jamaicans, but everybody from the more recent African descendants. Yeah, and that's why, because for them there was an advantage to having that what is normally bad is now an advantage to some of them, and therefore that gave them an advantage to survive. Therefore, they were more likely to reproduce. Therefore, that gene was passed along more than that would have been. Make sense? So it's another example of natural selection in action. And then I use this guy as a hypothetical. Dude's overweight. Let's just assume he eats the same amount of food as most other people. Well, that's a bad example because a lot of us are overweight right now. But let's just assume, yeah, he eats a very small amount of food, like barely bringing any calories in. The dude just can't lose weight. He eats very little, exercises a lot, but that's what he looks like. And let's just assume, this is all hypothetical. Let's just assume that the reason is because he's got some mutations in his genome where he's got a really, really slow metabolism. And everything he eats, his body is just really efficient at breaking it down. Remember I said way back when that when you eat food, like only 34% of that energy is put to work. The rest of it's lost as heat. Let's say for whatever reason, he's got some mutation where like almost all of it is put to work, right? So every time he eats, it's like, it's being used. Therefore, he gains a lot of weight. That would be bad, right? We have a lot of health problems from obesity and things like that, high blood pressure, diabetes, all that stuff. So let's just assume, people like him, maybe there's a few other people in the world that have this weird mutation that I'm making up. That's disadvantageous. Let's assume he's about to die. We can't tell by looking at him, but he's about to die, right? So he's most likely not going to pass along his genes because it's not healthy to be that way. But then let's assume World War III breaks out because China gets involved with Russia, and then finally NATO gets involved, and then UN gets involved. We have World War III. There's nuclear bombs all over the place. Plus, we already have supply chain issues, and then we get a new outbreak of a new strand of COVID-19, and basically the world almost comes to an end, right? Now, when that happens, there's going to be starvation, right? There's not going to be food on the shelves at the grocery stores. It's going to be hard to find food. People are going to try to finally grow their own food. They don't know how. People are going to be starving to death. You know who won't be starving to death? It's him. He'll be doing okay, right? He'll find a Twinkie from like 1980 that was hidden away somewhere, and he'll eat it. And unlike everybody else, his body's going to save all those calories and put them to use, right? So that's another example of where a bad gene, like right now it's bad, but then if World War III happened and we're all fighting to survive, all of a sudden that gene's a good thing. So he'd be more likely to survive because he's not dying of starvation. Therefore, he's more likely to reproduce. Therefore, the new population is going to be more of whatever hypothetical gene I just made up. Make sense? Gene is a bad thing, turns into a good thing. Why? Because there's a changing environment. Pretty simple. Obviously, that's just an example. If there's any questions about this on the exam, it would be about sickle cell. Definitely not about the hypothetical large guy, but even probably not even questions about the sickle cell because it is just an example. All right. So like we said, we were talking about code mutations, right? Changing the A's, the T's, and the C's, and the G's. But sometimes there are chromosomal mutations. So we're just talking about big old chunks of chromosome, something that you could actually see in a karyotype, not just by looking at the code. So chromosomal mutations that delete, disrupt, or rearrange many gene locations at once are almost certainly to be harmful, right? So that's why very often when you have an extra chromosome, like a whole chromosome, the fetus, it doesn't even make it to birth, right? But duplications of a gene or a small piece of the DNA through errors in meiosis can provide important sources of genetic variation, and they can eventually lead to new genes with novel functions. So basically what this slide is saying is if it's a big change, almost definitely it's going to be bad, but there's a slight chance it could be good. And I'm going to go back to that book I keep telling you about. This is a great example. It has something to do with the way humans see, and it had something to do with like some virus that one of our ancestors got a long time ago, and it duplicated something in our genome. And because of it duplicating, we can actually see better than we used to. I don't know. I'll find it and share it with you. But again, for this slide, the important take-home message is big mutations, almost definitely bad. Slight chance that it could be good. Any questions about that? All right. Oh, and again, that's another good topic for independent work if you want to look too. Like, what are some huge mutations that humans have had? And obviously, if they've had them and we're still around, there might be good ones. Your book also points out that in prokaryotes, mutations quickly generate genetic variation in a population, and that should make sense. So again, prokaryotes are things like bacteria. Eukaryotes are the more complicated everything else. Humans, plants, fungi, protists. But in prokaryotes, this makes sense that it would quickly make changes. As I'm sitting here talking, one bacteria can regenerate a few times, quite a few times, right, in this 50 minutes that we'll be here. Unlike a human, there's no human in this room that could come in without offspring, and I include that, and I mean also not pregnant either, and then leave with an offspring, right? We can't do that, much less do it multiple times in 50 minutes. So that's the one reason they move quickly. Another reason is, and we haven't really talked about this much because we don't talk too much about prokaryotes, is they are not diploid like we are. To remind you what we're talking about in the other chapters, diploid means we have 2 copies of each chromosome, right? Therefore, we have 2 copies of each gene. With them, they only have the 1 chromosome, right? So they only have the 1 allele. Right? You wouldn't even call it an allele because there is no different version. They only have the 1 gene. There are no different versions. So if you put a mutation in that gene right there, whatever it may be, then it's going to stay there. There are no other versions. And when it reproduces, it reproduces through mitosis. So it's just going to be a perfect copy, perfect genetic copy. Now, when we go through meiosis, it's not a perfect genetic copy, right? Let's say we have a random mutation in chromosome number 7, and it happens to be in our reproductive organs. So then when I produce sperm and you produce egg or sperm, whatever you may be, there's a 50% chance that you won't even pass along that mutation, right? Because you're doing 50-50, right? We don't know which chromosome you're getting. But anyway, we don't really talk much about prokaryotes. I'm glad your book threw that in there, but I'm not going to ask you anything about that on the exam. Ooh, any questions? All right. So unlike prokaryotes, let's talk about animals and plants. Your book decided to say, forget fungi, forget protists, just animals and plants. We have an average of about 1 mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation. Meaning, well, that makes sense, right? For like everybody that was born in 1980, for example, for every 100,000 genes of all those people, there was about 1 mutation, which isn't much. And not only that, but we have long lifespan between generations because, again, right, for a human, it takes you at least 9 months, about 9 months to produce a baby, and you've got to heal from that. And even if you went right at it, that's another 9 months. And again, we have diploid genomes that prevent most mutations from significantly affecting genetic variation from one generation to the next. Essentially, this slide is just the opposite of the last one. The last one's like, hey, for prokaryotes, mutations get around quickly. Here's why. And this one's saying, hey, for everything else, for plants and animals, it doesn't get around quickly. And here's why. But I won't ask you this on the exam either. I just want you to know that, just know in your mind that when there's a mutation involved in humans or animals or plants, it doesn't usually get around as quick. It's a slower process because of these things listed here, just for your own information. And I guess that'll be the next word for attendance. Extra credit attendance, because remember, even if you're watching this now, you still have to answer the videos or answer the questions for the video, but the next word will be plants. All right, next slide. Sexual reproduction. So again, we're still talking about these sources of genetic variation. And again, you already know this, so hopefully I can go through it a little bit quicker than I just did. Sexual reproduction. So we already know how meiosis 1 versus meiosis 2, that's mostly where we're getting our genetic variation from. But like your book says, sexually reproducing organisms, left that out there, not sexually organisms, not sexual organisms, but sexually reproducing organisms. For sexually reproducing organisms, most genetic variations in a population are from a unique combination of alleles that each individual inherits, which is a fancy way of saying it's all about the stuff you learned in chapter 8. It's all about how we shuffle things around. So if you look at your genome and compare it to your sibling, if you have a full sibling, and don't even look at the codes, just look at which chromosomes you got. You'd be like, if my brother was here, I could say, all right, I got chromosome 1 from, I don't know, I want to put this right. No, that's too complicated. Just remember, I don't want to spend too much time. And if I don't spend a lot of time, what I was about to say was just going to be confusing. So just remember that everything's shuffled around, right? When you get your chromosomes from your mom and your dad, right? When you got your chromosomes from your mom, you could have either gotten the one she got from her mom or her dad, right? Chromosome number 1 could have been from her mom or her dad. Chromosome number 2 could have been from her mom or her dad. Chromosome number 3 could have been from her mom or her dad, right? So when you're looking at all your chromosomes, numbers 1 through number 23, you could have, half of them from your grandma, half of them from your granddad, or maybe 3/4 from your grandma and 1/4 from your grandpa, right? It's all shuffled up. And it's this fresh assortment of existing alleles that arise every generation, or from the 3 random components that we learned about in chapter 8. Again, independent orientation of homologous chromosomes. That's what I was just trying to say. A really quick visualization. Nah, that won't work either. Independent assortment. Again, just remind you, that just says when all those chromosomes line up in the middle in metaphase, it's not like it's all mom chromosomes on the left and dad chromosomes on the right, right? It's all shuffled up. All 23 of them shuffled up. And then again, there's also crossing over. So remember, when those homologous chromosomes get next to each other in prophase of meiosis 1, sometimes they get so close that they literally swap chunks. So you'll have a mom chromosome with like a dad chunk on it, and then a dad chromosome with a mom chunk on it. And sometimes there's big chunks, sometimes it's little chunks, sometimes it never happens. Sometimes it happens more than once on the same chromosome, right? So that's all completely random. And then, of course, there's random fertilization, which just means really which sperm makes it to which egg is completely random, right? So everything on this slide is just a review of everything you learned in chapter 8. It's just saying it in the context of evolution. So any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about populations as the units of evolution. you've already been introduced to this concept because, for the lab you took, I had to remind you guys that it was the populations that changed, right? That bunch of moths is what changed. No single moth went from light colored to dark colored, right? It's the population that changed. Or as your book says, the evolutionary impact of natural selection is only apparent in the changes in a population over time. So it's not the individual, it is the population. That is an important question that is almost definitely going to be on the exam. Individuals do not change through natural selection. So you might even think, all right, but what about that moth? What about that one light moth that had the mutation that put out dark moths? Well, that itself wasn't natural selection. That was a small part of the entirety, which makes up natural selection. But that one thing happening, that one mutation resulting in those dark offsprings, that in itself was not natural selection. It wasn't natural selection until it was population after population after population where we had more and more and more darker moths and fewer and fewer and fewer light-colored moths. To define population, even though I've said this before, this is also another very important concept for now to the rest of the semester because we're going to use this term a lot. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and that interbreed. So the population of West Virginia, well, humans are a bad example because of the way we kind of get around, right? You could have a human from Puerto Rico who might end up interbreeding with a human from South Korea, right? It's possible. A better example would be something non-human. Like, all right, think about gray squirrels. Gray squirrels in West Virginia, that's a population. And then maybe the gray squirrels in Florida. It's the same species, but they're in different places, right? So they're not interbreeding. Yes?
You know how cavemen had like the eyebrows that kind of hung over their eyes?
Mm-hmm.
How come that kind of went away?
Great question. And the short answer, and maybe I can find a time to give you a longer answer a little bit later. That's funny you should mention that. It's because it's a different species, actually. The cavemen, the ones you just described, are actually Neanderthals, which is not Homo sapien. So we were a different species. That being said, and as far as this conversation is concerned, you can ignore what I'm about to say, but just to answer your question, sometimes species do interbreed, which is a whole different thing. But yeah. Long story short, it's because the ones that look like that were Neanderthals and they went extinct as a different species. But the answer is actually the real answer is actually longer, complicated, and more interesting. Maybe I'll find time to share it. But you definitely need to know what a population is, right? Same species, living in the same area and interbreeding, right? Or even just they're the same species at the same place at the same time, right? They're competing for the same resources. The same things affect them. Again, using the squirrels as an example, the squirrels on WVSU's campus would be affected by a chemical spill next door, right? You know the one I'm talking about where they have all that dangerous crap? If something were to go wrong there, the gray squirrels on WVSU's campus would probably die. Meanwhile, the gray squirrels in Florida, they are okay, right? Completely different situation. They're not a population. They're the same species, but they're not one population. Anyway, different populations of the same species may be geographically isolated from another. Again, West Virginia squirrels, Florida squirrels, just an example. So the exchange of genetic material either never or rarely occurs. So who knows? Obviously, you would think never when I'm talking about these two different squirrel populations, but I guess it is possible that maybe some squirrel somehow gets on a train, right? And it's afraid to jump off, so it makes it from West Virginia to Florida or back or vice versa. And therefore, the genes are now gone from the West Virginia squirrel population to the Florida squirrel population. It's possible. Such isolation is common in populations that are confined to different lakes or islands. For example, this right here. Let's say you have the same species of, I don't know, someone name a freshwater fish that you like. Bass, all right. So let's say there's bass in each one of those, right? It's the same species, but that's different populations, right? The ones that live in there are one population, that's a different population, that's a different population, that's a different population. Because the bass, generally speaking, aren't getting up and going to the other island, right? Of course, it's not impossible. It could be a fish that swoops up and grabs one and tries to fly it home and then accidentally drops it in there, right? Or maybe there's a big flood temporarily that connects this and makes it one big pond or lake for a while. Then the flood recedes and they go back to being separate populations. So it is possible for that to happen. What your book doesn't mention, and I'm going to try to mention it very quickly here, is try to imagine, again, all these different populations. Also, imagine that these ponds are very different. Maybe they're different in their depth, obviously their width. Maybe they have different predators living in them. So different living conditions. So over millions of generations, maybe what used to be the same species in these isolated lakes will become different species. Because maybe it's very advantageous to be, I don't know, light colored in this pond, while it's very advantageous to be dark colored in this pond. Maybe in this one, it's more advantageous to be able to move quick, but here it's more advantageous to be able to hide, right? So maybe bigger is better, smaller is better. Maybe here it's better to be more resistant to warm water, here better resistant to cold water. All these different changes, eventually over generations and generations, you might come up with a new species. And that's sometimes how we get new species that derive from one species. Because they started off as the same species, but now they have all these different things that are driving this change in the different populations. And that could sometimes lead to a new species. Wish we had more time to give some examples, but we don't. Anyway, any questions about the idea of populations and what a population is? All right. That brings us to what a gene pool is. Since we know what a population is, the next word you need to understand is gene pool. And a gene pool consists of all copies of every type of allele at every single location on a chromosome in everybody in the population. You guys already knew what a gene pool was. Basically, if you look at my genome and all my codes and all the different alleles I have and all my different genes, right? Well, I already said it. That's my genome, right? But if you look at everybody, that's a gene pool. Does that make sense? Genome is just my genes, my set of genes. A gene pool will be looking at everybody's genome in the population. That's a better word. That's how they should put it. This is from your book, though. I didn't write this. So my idea, it might be easy to remember, a gene pool is everybody's genome. Does that make sense? So it's just like looking at everybody's. And you should, if you've already started this week's exam, this week's lab, you should already be familiar with this idea. Because you're looking, in that case, of all the genomes of all the fish that live in there. Of course, you're only focused, in that particular case, on that one allele, the R's, right? The thing that makes it white or orange or spotted, but still. So that's what a gene pool is. So I said this at the beginning of the lecture, or before the lecture even started. Some of you guys came in late. For those of you who came in late, make sure you email me. You can still watch the video and answer the questions to get full credit. Obviously, for coming in late, you get half credit. For everyone else, make sure you email me. For everybody online, you can email me if you want with the attendance words, so you can get extra credit for being live, but you still have to do the questions. That being said, I hate to change things up on you, but you got to stay on your toes, right? Something has come up. We will not have lecture in person on Friday or Monday. Therefore, we have to do it online on Friday and Monday. So don't come in person. And to be fair, since I'm forcing you to be online on Friday and Monday as opposed to coming in, then I'm not going to force you to do the questions. So if you're online live, then the attendance points, the attendance words will work. But if you're not live, if you feel like sleeping in, and I don't blame you, then you can watch the video and answer the questions instead. Is that all? Everybody clear on that? We're not going to be here in person on Friday or Monday. You have the option of coming live to the video or watching the video after. David, I said that wrong, but you get it, right? All right. That's it. I'll see you guys online on Friday.
I got a question.
Question, yes.
Could I video chat you later so you could give me some assistance?
Yes, yeah. Email me that question so we can go back and forth and try to find a time.
Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely be glad to help you.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I hope that was good news for you for not having to do the questions.